this is our last session before the lunch break. The Pondy Lit Fest is happy to announce that the book stalls at the venue feature titles by all the authors speaking at PLF 2024. So do grab your copies and get them signed. Books by Sri Aurobindo Ashram are specially featured. This festival also features an independent stall by Anadi Foundation for the great work they are doing in education, well-being, sustainability, culture and heritage, and an independent stall by Go Force, promoting nationalism through merchandising and gifting. We invite on stage Kanchan Gupta, Senior Advisor, Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, Government of India, to talk to us about the transformation of modern India, the story.
Namaste everybody. Let me begin by thanking the organizers of Pondy Lit Fest for inviting me this year. I have had the good fortune of attending every edition of the festival since it was launched, and the first edition was incidentally held in the same premises, and it was not by design, but it was a last minute arrangement we had to do because venues were denied to the organizers under pressure from the usual suspects. Now, Alo has sort of made my job easier. She wanted me to speak on the transformation of India. So we have had several sessions over here. Shamika, my colleague in government, she has had two wonderful presentations. One on why every Indian deserves free food paid for by people like you and me. And the other one is her presentation this morning on elimination of poverty, absolute poverty in India. So one could talk about hard data about India's growth, India's emergence. But most of it is known that India is going to be the largest, is the third largest economy in the world. Most probably it will become the second largest economy in the next couple of years. It is the fastest growing economy, faster than China. It will continue to grow at anything between 7 and 8% over the next couple of years, which means there will be greater generation of prosperity and people will be earning more than what they are right now. So if we look at today's India, it bears very little resemblance from where we were 75 years ago, 76 years ago, when we emerged as an independent republic. We were poor, and we were not only poor, we were, I think, dirt poor. And from there we have come a long way. So we were a country which had been robbed of $45 trillion over a span of 300 years by the colonizers. Now, this is not some figure which has been concocted by the loony right, as people often call the right. This is a figure which was calculated by one of the leading left-wing economists, Utsa Patnaik, and she explains how all this money was robbed from this country. When we became free, we did not get the money which the rulers, then colonial rulers, owed us. That was the war debt. We didn't have any bridging finances. We did not have hospitals, we did not have sufficient colleges, we did not have an education system that was self-sustaining or that was trained into producing people for the national good. We had an education system that was designed to produce people for the colonial good. And the early years were difficult, and although Nehru is commended for laying the foundations of a new India, it was really not Nehru but individuals who went about doing it. The All India Institute of Medical Sciences, it was set up by the health minister of that time, Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. If you look at the first IIT which was set up in the country, IIT Kharagpur, it was set up by B.C. Roy, and it was set up without any central assistance. First, a small institute was opened in Calcutta, then fields which were meant to produce paddy for the British troops, British Army, those were converted in Kharagpur. Those fields were converted into the campus of what we now know as IIT Kharagpur. And one could go on and on and on. We had a terrible problem with smallpox in this country, and we did not have the vaccine. We did not have the capacity or capability to produce vaccines on our own. So we had to be dependent on smallpox vaccine that was donated to us. And every time a shipment of one box of vaccines would come, there would be photographs in the newspaper, front page photographs of senior ministers, Congress leaders lining up over there to receive that gift of charity. Unfortunately, even those vaccines could not be used properly because Mr. Nehru thought Indians did not need to be told or trained into how to go about vaccinating people. So he encouraged a rebellion among the bureaucrats against the WHO officials, and the smallpox vaccination drive suffered so much that we went through an endemic of smallpox in this country not once but thrice. So from there, if we look at how we handled the COVID situation, how we not only manufactured vaccine but gave it to others, again it shows it tells us a story of how far India has traveled along the road of development, of growth, of prosperity, and self-reliance. On food, I don't know how many of you would remember it, but there was a time when we were dependent on US charity. It was US wheat, which was meant for cattle feed, that would be shipped out to India. And it was under an American law called PL 480. And it was a ship-to-mouth existence that we had in this country till well into the early 70s, when the quote-unquote the Green Revolution happened. And since then, as Shamika explained yesterday, we now have a food index of 128. That means if we are consuming 100 units, we are producing 128 units. So almost more than 25% of the food which we produce is in excess of what we need. And that again is a story of India's prosperity, India's growth, India's development. So if we look at it in terms of economic growth, economic development, we have come a long way, a long journey. And we are no longer a slumdog country. We are no longer a Bhuka Nanga Bharat. We are no longer a povertarian India. But the question which we should really be asking is whether we have been able to sort of also inculcate a sense of identity as to who are we. Who are we as Indians? Who are we as members of a dharmic group? Who are we as individuals? Who are we as families, as communities? And these questions, I think, have suffered enormously, and answers to them remain still out there because of the forced secularization that happened of India. And when I say forced secularization, I don't think before 1947 that sense of a fake secular identity as a nation existed. So what was done is that it was transplanted, it was grafted, but not through the first constitution, but during the emergency when it was grafted into the preamble, and then the activation happened much faster, although it began in 1952 itself. So if we look back, the Hindu personal laws were reformed, but other personal laws were left untouched. And the logic was Hindus would accept reform, but others won't. And therefore, because they won't, they need to be protected. Now that is a twisted logic. And that is why I say it was a forced secularization. And it never really worked, because if you look at it and how it happened, Nehru brought in the Hindu personal law reforms. There were 5 major reforms. I'm not suggesting or debating the necessity of those reforms. That's a separate thing. We can talk about it separately. But it happened while Christian personal law, the Muslim personal law, those remained untouched. And then we see when Indira Gandhi becomes Prime Minister, and she wants to bring in the adoption law, which would allow every Indian to adopt a child. And Islam prohibits adoption. So you had people running riot in the streets in opposition to the adoption bill. And it was in response to the adoption bill that a monstrosity called Muslim Personal Law Board was set up. And the Muslim Personal Law Board was set up as an NGO, not as a government body, not as a quasi-government body, although they named themselves using words which are misleading. It conveys the impression as if it is a quasi-government body or a government body, which it isn't. Now, if we look further down the line, Rajiv Gandhi becomes Prime Minister. The most scorching decision of that government, apart from foolishly sending troops into Sri Lanka, was to overturn the Shah Bano judgment. And again, the judgment was overturned because the government said Muslims are not going to accept the judgment. Therefore, their non-acceptance has to be protected and encoded through the Muslim women protection on divorce bill, which is again misleadingly named, because what the bill serves to do is that a Muslim woman is being denied alimony and maintenance on divorce. And then that is followed by an uproar, and to counterbalance it, the locks on the disputed structure in Ayodhya are opened, which in turn sets into motion a series of events that we collectively know as the Ayodhya movement. Now, where am I coming in from? The point which I'm trying to make is that when you have forced secularization, there will be a counter force of desecularization. When people will resist the forced secularization and they will opt for desecularization. And for the last 30, 40 odd years, what we have been witnessing is the desecularization of Indian society. Now, on the face of it, this may seem to be something very problematic, but what it has done is that it has sharpened the idea of Hindu aspirations, of Hindu political aspirations. And while doing that, it has also revived the debate over who are we, what are we. And this idea of Hindutva that we now talk of gathers speed during this time, and because that reflects the larger concept, the popular concept of who are we and what are we. It brings together three different strains. It brings Hinduism, that is the religious strain. It brings into the fold cultural ideas, cultural identities, or broadly the culture of India, and it brings into the stream the idea of nationalism. So hence you have the birth of Hindu cultural nationalism, although it is essentially a rebirth of this concept. The very idea of being a Hindu, being a culturalist, and being a nationalist is not something which was invented by Veer Savarkar in his treatise called Hindutva. It actually goes back to Bengal. It dates back to Bengal. And the original seeds were sown by the maternal grandfather of Sri Aurobindo, that is Raj Narayan Bose. He gives a lecture. He was deeply influenced by the Brahmo Samaj, and he was a great defender of the Brahmo Samaj as the receptacle of all that was good and refined about Hinduism. That was his interpretation of Brahmoism. So when the conservative Hindus of Calcutta began expressing their opposition to Brahmo ideals of what Hinduism is all about, you had Sri Aurobindo's maternal grandfather Raj Narayan Bose taking them on. And he gave a very famous lecture on Hindu Dharmer Shreshthuta, which is the superiority of Hindu religion. So we should bear in mind, he spoke about the superiority of Hindu religion or Hinduism or the Hindu identity. He did not speak about the supremacy. So it was not an idea of religious supremacism or a racial supremacism that he was floating, but the idea of superiority in terms of the dharmic concept of that religion, i.e. Hinduism. Ten years later or 20 years later, the conservative society, the conservative Bengali Hindu was not very convinced of it. We had Chandranath Bose. He came up with a book called Hindutva or the essence of Hinduism. Now there he posits the conservative view of Hinduism and Hindu Dharma. And yet, after that, what happens is we don't see one crossing out the other. We don't see Rajnarayan Bose crossing out Chandranath Bose or vice versa. We see an amalgamation rising out of it of what really should be the Hindu identity. And although I am no scholar of Sri Aurobindo and his works, but the little I could make out from his Uttarpara speech, which was again referred to over here yesterday or today, this morning I think, he talks of the Hinduism, the Sanatan Dharma which he talks about, is the amalgamation of Hindutva and Hindu Dharmer Shreshtata, the superiority of Hinduism. And today when we are talking about Hindutva or the Hindu identity as to who are we really need to go back to where we began in terms of conceiving the idea. It is not a rejectionist idea. It is not an exclusivist idea. And it is definitely not an exclusionary idea. To make this point, Rajnarayan Bose and others, they started what was called the Hindu Mela. And again, the Hindu Mela precedes Ganeshotsav, Tilak's idea of mobilizing popular support through Ganesh Chaturthi. And the Hindu Mela was the precursor of the Swadeshi movement, because what was the Hindu Mela projecting? The Hindu Mela was projecting the Hindu identity, not in terms of being a Hindu or a Muslim, but a civilizational cultural identity. It was promoting local industry, it was promoting local artisans, it was promoting local produce, and it was also promoting indigenous, rooted in the soil entertainment for the masses. Now we have got used to the circus and the clown as a source of entertainment, or movies as a source of entertainment. There were no movies at that time, but they revived Hindu popular folk art or folk performance as a form of entertainment both for the masses and the classes. Again, if we look back to where we are today, we are reinventing ourselves, we are re-looking at ourselves in terms of what can we do to promote our local produce, our local industry, make in India, made in India, conceived in India. The person who spoke before me spoke about AI driven software which is being conceived and produced by Indians, and it is being branded with a Hindu name, that is Hanuman. Having said that, there are dangers. There are dangers of slipping into nativism. There are dangers of becoming like frogs in a well, where we end up listening to each other. It's an echo chamber. So we must therefore draw sustenance from what Tagore said, that your world should be a world of windows, and keep all the windows open so that everything that's happening around you reaches you, and you can then pick up that which is good, that which is best for you. Which brings me to the last point, that of modernization. Now, often the danger again which we are facing today is that the nativist Hindu says that modernization is aping the West and therefore not acceptable. But modernization, even in the 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, 20th century, when modernism was being talked about, when it was being adopted and adapted, it was not framed in terms of the Western way of life or the Western idea of modernism being grafted on this soil. It was always in terms of science, in terms of education, in terms of learning, in terms of enlightenment. And we must continue with that strand of modernism without becoming anti-modernist. To be modern does not make you or your faith redundant. You can be what you are, and you can yet adopt and adapt much more to make yourself better. After all, the best scientists India has ever produced, Jagdish Chandra Bose, he was a Brahmo Samaji. He rejected what he thought were the negatives of conservative Hinduism. And he said that I stand for modernism. And for him, modernism was science. In art, in culture, I was explaining to Alo yesterday, the first conception, the very first conception of Bharat Mata, as to, what does Bharat Mata look like? What does Bharat Mata represent? The first conception of Bharat Mata was by Abanindranath Tagore. His famous painting, which was called Bharat Mata. It is Tagore and Bankim Babu, it was Tagore, and it was the Bengal Renaissance which conceived of land and soil and nation as a feminine form. Now, this is important because if you look at Savarkar's Hindutva, he refers to the land and the soil as fatherland. Punya Bhu, Pitri Bhu. That which is your fatherland is holy land. The Bengal Renaissance said, no, this is your motherland. It's feminine. And hence Bharat Mata, if you look at the full lyrics of what is our national anthem, there is a stanza which refers to Adhinayak as mother. And although our friends keep on citing Tagore's famous essay on nationalism, which was written after the First World War, nobody goes into the latter part of his writings, which is far removed from what he thought of nation and the idea of nationhood and nationalism. In the latter part of his life, he talks about nation and the soil and the land being worshipful. And he says that I bow before, Bankim Babu said, I bow before thee. Tagore goes one step forward and says, I touch my forehead on the soil. So these are the ideas that should be revived. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We don't need to reinvent who are we, what are we. And as India becomes prosperous and as India grows and as India develops, at some point we will be confronted with this question as to who are we. Huntington, who wrote the famous Clash of Civilizations, his second book was Who Are We? I mean, an America which is so rich, and an America which is a superpower, and yet the people of the country are not sure as to who are they and where do they stand as Americans. So instead of us facing the same angst and the same question, we should start building up that identity. We should start looking deeper into the question of being Hindu, of Hinduness, of Hindutva, of Hindu cultural nationalism, of just only cultural nationalism, if you wish. And that, I think, is something which is very important for us to do right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Kanchanda. One of the things I'm curious about is how to recover identity, national identity, in the reality of cultural trauma, historical trauma, right? Here is a group that has, whoever's lived on this land has encountered centuries of oppression, which has led to a collective trauma, which is influencing the behavior and therefore how we hold our identity. So I'm curious if you have any sense of how do we take along the reality that a cultural identity, our national identity, holds trauma, and how do we heal that collective trauma before we can step into the fullness of what we are?
I think one good thing about being Hindu, whether in the religious sense, whether in the political sense, whether in the cultural sense, is that it sustains growth, it sustains regeneration, and it's a spring well of hope. And while I agree with you that there is this collective trauma, and that trauma continues to be there because we still have opposition within to being Hindu. The Supreme Court was adjudicating a case on hate speech, and a sitting judge of that particular bench, Justice Joseph, when the Solicitor General brought up an incident of abuse of Hindus, of Hinduism, Justice Joseph started laughing. I mean, he thought it was a bit of a joke. Now, the judgment was that whoever indulges in recognized hate speech, the police has to suo motu take action against that individual or institution and begin proceedings of prosecution. A test case was Stalin's abuse of Sanatan Dharma. It was a clear case of hate speech. But the police never filed a suo motu case against him. Later, they were forced to file a case, but nobody has heard anything about it since then. And the Supreme Court, which thought that hate speech was something so dear to it, has not bothered to even pursue as to why there has been no action. So there are many such examples of how the enemy within continues to gnaw at our identity. And curiously, if ever there is a rebirth of India, as a term used by Sri Aurobindo again, I sometimes wonder whether Bengal shall be a part of that rebirth. The Hindu in Bengal has, I think, suffered the gravest and most severe erosion of the Hindu identity. Part of it because of trauma, of continuous assault on that identity, and largely because of the politics they have chosen to adopt and follow, which has become an assault on that identity.
Kanchanda, first of all, thank you very much for a very in-depth story which enlightens us in many angles. So we have looked into the rear-view mirror, and when we want to look ahead in terms of what actions we should take at an individual level, at a family level, in our interactions, in education, in organizations and government, what might you think would be playbooks? Because playbooks, once created, are what can be manifest consistently across populations. So what is that playbook? And how are we working towards a playbook which allows us to manifest what we need to manifest in order to get back where we should be?
It's interesting that you should ask this. Something very profound, a very profound experiment is being carried out by Hungary. I was in Budapest last month, and it was, I was part of, I had gone along with someone else, and we were mostly getting briefed by the most powerful ministry in the government, which is the culture ministry. It is not the defense ministry or the home ministry or the food ministry or whatever, which is the most powerful ministry, but it is the culture ministry. And the culture minister is a young person with very clear ideas, and his remit includes junior school, not high school and higher education, but junior school. It includes culture, it includes sports, it includes youth affairs, everything. And their agenda is how to restore value education in a system from where value education was erased, first during the Soviet occupation and later by the liberals who came to power, and that's how it happened. And they are very clear. They have defined the ideal Hungarian father is a man who has 3 children, 2 tagging along with him and 1 on his shoulder, who goes to church every Sunday, and the ideal home is where meals are cooked and eaten together, etc., etc. Now, the point I'm trying to make is that more than individuals or organizations, the government has to have the courage to bring in restorative policies. For a long time, we have been talking about the need to restore moral values in our curriculum. That has not happened. That has not even happened in the new education policy. Everybody is scared that this will trigger a reaction and a rejection. But of course there will be reaction, of course there will be rejection, but it is the government's job to force it down. If you could force down fake secularism on the people of this country, you can at least partly restore their crisis of identity and halt the erosion, rapid erosion of that identity by bringing in value-based education, by bringing in by instituting corrections in the history texts, which again you are scared to do because of the possible reaction. So this is a long drawn battle, and ultimately I think it is also dependent on how insistent people are on change. And if people are really insistent, then government has to do it, and that is the only way out.
Kanchanda, thank you for very much for a very erudite speech. My question to you is that is there any wing in Ministry of I&B for battling the false narrative, and what are we doing to correct the right narratives, which many of the things which you have spoken, but I don't see many of those things percolating down. Thank you.
See, the Information and Broadcasting Ministry's remit is very restricted, and much of the space where the ministry had direct control has gradually eroded, and probably for the best, over the years. Doordarshan and All India Radio are there, but with very limited access for a variety of reasons. You have the NFDC, which is totally in the control of lefties, because all creative artists have to be lefties. You have the FTII, which again is a viper's den. So what do you do? I mean, it's a very frustrating process. We thought of bringing in some checks and balances. The government is not bothered about fake news that does not impact the government. But when you put out fake news on the government or about a government's decision or something, etc., policy, then it becomes the responsibility of the government to flag it. The Bombay High Court has struck it down as unconstitutional. Therefore, by implication, what the judiciary is saying is that fake news is constitutional and correcting that fake narrative is unconstitutional. It's a very interesting judgment which all of you should read. It says the government's argument was that the government is charged with facts and figures and accuracy of information. The judge says it is not the government's right but the citizens. Of course, I mean that's absurd. The judge need not have said it. Nowhere in the world do governments have rights. It is the people who have rights. And responsibility devolves on the government to ensure that those rights are upheld. So if it is the people's right, if the people have a right to accurate information, it is the government's responsibility to ensure that the information is accurate. Logically, that would be the consequential meaning. But to the judge, the difference between right and responsibility is not obvious. And out of pique, he says that this amounts to censorship. How does it amount to censorship? So we are hamstrung. We are hamstrung politically. We are hamstrung by the judiciary. We are hamstrung by an opposition which refuses to recognize, even at this stage, the necessity of a common idea of the nation's good, collective good. So one can despair, but one should not despair. And as I said, we should work towards being what we are and asserting that identity.
How much will freeing Hindu temples help us towards that identity, and why isn't the government doing anything about it?
I think I'm a wrong person to ask this question, but the central government, what I understand of the problem, that the central government is not involved with temple control. It is all the temple endowments and Hindu endowment acts are state government acts, and it is for the state governments to remove those acts or to sort of let those laws lapse. Now, the fact that there is no great pressure on the state governments tells its own story. Otherwise, they would have done it, because there are no political consequences or electoral consequences you have this situation. But you also have a situation where, for instance, in Karnataka, one particular temple, I am told, went into dispute because two mutts claimed control over it and they couldn't come to an agreement. They went to court. The courts just sent it into government control, government custody. And if you look at the history, I think a lot of those temples would have a similar history.
Namaskar, sir. Thank you very much. And my question. My question is, aren't we in order to tackle one dogmatic cult, we are becoming other? As far as my observation goes.
Yeah, I get where you're coming from, and that's why I said that there is a very obvious threat, and that threat is to become like frogs in a well, where you speak to each other, where you talk to each other, and it becomes a self-serving ecosystem, and that is not what we should be, and that is not what being Hindu is. I thought I made that very clear.
Sir, one more question about the academia. I'm in the Pondicherry Central University, and as far as my observation goes there, it's the professors who teaches students nationalism is a toxic patriotism directly. So, and I don't think that it's a wrong, but what about the other perspective of it? They don't give the students the choice to choose their own ideology. They give the ideology. Now the students start doing, they cherry pick the facts which supports the ideology.
I think we have failed. We have collectively failed in certain ways. We have not been able to produce academics in sufficient numbers to swamp out the lefties in academia. And this is because the good Hindu, the intelligent Hindu, the bright Hindu chose to become an engineer or a doctor or an IT professional. He set up IT companies. We have been able to set up Infosys, but we have not been able to set up a Hindu college or a Hindu university or a Hindu educational institution. And that also tells its own story of short-sightedness, of not being where we should have been during the formative years over the last 75 years.
Sir, I had a question. If you look at the media content, a lot of fake news comes in because it gets pushed out because of some agenda, and so many good things government is doing which people are not aware of. So both ways it is happening. If you look at today's data, which Ms. Sharmila ma'am spoke about, wrong sources are spreading wrong information, but it gets so much pushed, and the right information, so much good things are happening that is not getting pushed. What I'm asking is, so are we also planning to use technology like generative AI, which can do a lot of...
Yes, we are.
Okay.
We are also
problem.
working on a policy, because now the trend is shifting very rapidly, and maximum consumption of data as in content, is via handheld sets. So we are working on a policy which will take us directly to the handheld device than through a platform or a intermediary. We are working on that, and that's where AI also comes in. But I must say that, and I think Shamika, who is here, would agree with me, that there is universal, barring the odd man out, and barring, when I say odd man out, I mean Rahul Gandhi, the broad consensus is that India has changed for the better, that absolute poverty has declined, that health indicators have improved, consumption patterns have changed. One of the other studies which Shamika has done recently, it's on consumption patterns of Indians. And you can always be an idiot like Rahul Gandhi and say that people are not eating enough cereals or pulses because they can't afford it. But because he misses the fact that they are spending more on consuming fresh vegetables or fresh fruits.
Yeah.
So that will always be there. But I think there is a recognition, even if it's a grudging recognition, that things are changing for the better. Thank you.